So actually, I think Michael is actually the one that stole my thunder because he explained the entire reason that a corporate accelerator exists in the last question, which was, I think one of you guys asked, how do you expand into a new market when maybe you don't really have a presence there, et cetera, et cetera? And the answer was, well, maybe you partner up with someone who has some sort of distribution platform there. And that's basically
switch mics real quick.
The main idea behind what Wyra is. So with that as a kind of introduction, I'm going to go through my presentation. This is me a long time ago, actually. This is me a couple days ago in Egypt, thanks to Vitaly and Mike and Max, who generously took us to Cairo to kind of meet some startups. And as I go through the presentation, I'm going to explain to you what we're doing here, because I know a lot of you guys probably have that as your primary question. Telefonica is great, but really, what can you do for me? So my history, as Vitaly kind of hinted at, is I grew up in New York. Originally, I immigrated from Jamaica, grew up in New York, went to Yale College, Yale Law School. Originally, I thought that I was going to be a lawyer. In fact, I was a lawyer for about 5 years doing corporate mergers and acquisitions and securities law. Then I moved to Barcelona, which is where I lived for about 9 years, 4 of them working as a lawyer. But at one point, the bosses, the partner, said to me, well, Gary, if you're going to stick around a lot longer, you're going to have to switch to a smaller salary, a local salary. So that was the moment that I became an entrepreneur. I actually created a company that focused on property search engine in Spain and Latin America. We did that for about 5 years. The company still exists. But there were 2 things. One is we raised a lot of money. Well, at least for Spain, we raised about 4 million euros. So that was a kind of good thing. But then the second thing is it became really hard to raise the second fund, because at that point in Spain, it didn't really seem as if there was that much money for a Series B. And after about 5 years of thinking, well, we have 20 employees, that's kind of cool, but I actually want to do something more in my life, I went on to IE Business School, which is where I taught entrepreneurship for about a year. And then all of a sudden, one day, Telefonica came and they said, well, Gary, we want you to do something similar to what you've been doing at IE, but we want you to do it for us. And originally, this was kind of my reaction. I wasn't really sure why I would want to work with a company like Telefonica. I really had a kind of very negative opinion of corporates, and I always thought of myself as kind of better than they were. And I think this is a sentiment that's generally shared throughout the ecosystem. So if you look at this article in TechCrunch from last year, you know, it says corporate accelerators are an oxymoron. Or if you look at this article written by one of the leaders of Techstars in the UK, John Bradford, he says he's going to explain the good, the bad, and the ugly about corporate accelerators. And I can kind of empathize, because I shared that original kind of antipathy to corporate accelerators and to corporates in general. And I think the idea, first and foremost, is that you know, there are these big guys who are just going to throw the little guys around. And so you kind of have this David versus Goliath mentality and see it not as a potential win-win, but really as one guy's going to win and the other guy's going to lose, and it seems pretty clear which is which. I think there's also the kind of coolness factor that corporates are usually seen as these kind of guys in ties who are really boring and really kind of out of it, out of date, whereas, you know, entrepreneurs kind of like to envision themselves as superheroes who are somehow going to change the world and potentially even fly. And I think that you see this a lot in the language of disruption. For example, I remember we did an event where we focused it on musical startups. And so we said we were going to bring about 20 of our startups around the world that focus on music, but we were also going to bring Sony and Spotify and some of these guys to the event as well. And I remember one of our startups came up and they said, we're going to tell you why Spotify sucks and why Sony sucks and why artists hate Spotify and why they're all going to come to us. And so after the event, we had to have a little talk, which was, okay, if we're going to organize these events for you, you can't always see the corporates as the bad guys. Sometimes you have to think about how, as Michael said, you might be able to partner with a corporate as a way of generating growth for your company, especially at the very beginning when they have a lot more resources than you do, and they are the ones with the customers, and you're really trying to get your foot in the door. So in terms of the top 4 critiques of corporate accelerators, I would say the first is that they have too much money and that it seems as if somehow or another they're not authentic, that they're going to, I think that there's a kind of hesitation, especially from the original accelerators, to believe that corporates actually have some sort of a role to play within the ecosystem. I think the second is the idea that a lot of corporate accelerators don't take an equity stake in the companies, and sometimes people think that that's a bad sign, because if you really believe in something, why don't you actually invest in it, put your money where your mouth is? The third concept is that since startups really have nothing to do with the corporate's core business, at some point, if it's a CSR project or a marketing project, it's going to be generate some sort of fatigue in the company, especially as internal politics start to take hold. And lastly, this idea that corporate accelerators have generated very few success cases, and largely that may be due to the first three reasons. So I think the idea is generally that people think that corporate accelerators should just kind of go as quickly as possible. They have no real room in the ecosystem. And my presentation now is to explain to you why, after working in Telefonica for 4 years, I don't think that's the case. Not only because they pay me not to think that way, but also because I actually generally believe that we've generated success stories that show what a corporate can do for entrepreneurs. So Vitaly kind of hinted at this before, this idea that Telefonica is a huge company. Last year, or this is 2013 now, we had about 57 billion euros in revenue, so it's a pretty huge company. But I think it had a fundamental problem, and Telefonica started to realize this, which was that over time, you started to see that business lines that had been very profitable for Telefonica suddenly started to get eaten away by startups. And so at the beginning, if you're Telefonica, you don't really pay attention to them. I mean, this WhatsApp thing, how big can that really become? Are they really going to be able to eat away all of my SMS business? Skype, is that really going to be big? You know what I mean? This whole, who's going to want to talk to people over the internet, you know, things like that. And then all of a sudden you start to realize that your roaming business is gone, your SMS business is gone, and all of a sudden people are trying to offer free Wi-Fi everywhere. So you're like, okay, well, either I need to get into the game or I'm going to be out of business really, really soon. Like these guys, Kodak, you know, they actually had the ability to foresee that there would be digital cameras, but they didn't really think it was important enough for them to kind of position themselves within that market. Or Blockbuster didn't really take Netflix quite so seriously at the beginning. Now Netflix is huge, Blockbuster is pretty much bankrupt. Or Barnes & Noble didn't really see Amazon as a huge threat, and now all of a sudden, I guess they do. So I think everyone started to realize that maybe Steve Jobs wasn't such a fluke, and he might be a kind of inspiration as to what the future of the corporate universe should look like, which is people trying to figure out how to be more entrepreneurial within their companies so that they can actually make a lot of money. For example, this is a slide from the very beginning of Wayra. I was a bit surprised as well because at that point I still wasn't 100% sure like how this whole corporate thing was going to work out. But a partner from the Silicon Valley office came and said 82% of the CEOs expect that the global economy would stay the same or get worse. So this was in 2011, but 83% were confident that their companies would grow if they were able to find new business models or identify new products and services for their customers. And I think this, again, is pretty much what Wayra is all about. But it's not just Wayra or Telefonica that's seeing working with startups or acquiring startups as the way to make sure that you stay relevant going forward. Facebook bought WhatsApp for a very, very clear reason, and that was because they realized, okay, we may be the leaders today, but if this whole mobile thing is going to take off, and if we haven't been able to position ourselves really well in the messenger space, maybe we need to work more closely, i.e. buy the company that seems to be the future winner in that area. Same thing with Google and Nest. You can say Microsoft buying Skype had something to do with that, and even Apple, which we always think is kind of the dominant company, right now at least, which was able to get, what was it, $75 billion in 1 quarter recently, still had to buy Beats because they realized, okay, even though we have iTunes going forward is going to lose relevance. It seems as if there are other trends that are taking hold. Maybe we need to actually stop competing with these startups and figure out how we can work with them so that we continue to be relevant going forward. So this is part of the presentation now where I'd like to say that I think a lot of times when we come to these sorts of events, people tend to think, well, in London, we all have it correct, so you guys all have to learn from what's going on in London or in other ecosystems. And I think that's generally not the case. I think Silicon Valley is pretty much a very unique instance, but in London, there's definitely this feeling, and London's where I'm based now, and Spain was where I was based before, that we still have a lot to learn about entrepreneurship as well. And I think this was one of the articles from a couple of years, or 3 years now, back in The Economist, saying that the problem that Europe is going through right now is actually not so much about growth or about the currency, it's actually about the fact that Europe doesn't know how to encourage ambitious entrepreneurs. And so this was the slide or the figure that stuck out at me at that point, where it said that from 1950 to 2007, the US created $52 big companies, but Europe only created 12. And that, again, is because of companies like Telefonica being the main ones in a lot of economies, and there being an inability to kind of figure out how you can generate the next Skype or the next Facebook or the next WhatsApp or whatever the case may be in Europe, as opposed to having it always go to the US. And I think that this is kind of something I just heard about this morning, so I kind of just looked it up really quickly because I saw it on Bloomberg, and they were saying where the digital economy is moving the fastest, and they were looking at kind of future trends and realizing that there are current markets that are kind of doing really, really well right now, but the future is all in what we're calling like emerging markets that are kind of actually investing in the digital universe and kind of having the markets that are going to be relevant going forward. And I think this was kind of the insight that led the second guy over there. Well, actually, the first guy is the head of research and development of Telefonica, and the second guy is the current COO of Telefonica. So this was definitely an initiative that was taken from the very highest level to make sure that Telefonica positioned itself well going forward. And this is them greeting the King of Spain at an event at the launch of Wayra. And I think Telefonica is taking this pretty seriously. So this is kind of how they described themselves last year at the Mobile World Congress, which is kind of the biggest event for the sector. And it said Telefonica is aiming to become a digital telco. And if you look at the last line or the last paragraph, it says they've identified Wayra and talent and entrepreneurship as key components of their ability to participate in this digital revolution. Okay, so to go back into where we are physically right now, we're physically in 12 countries. We have 14 academies around the world. Most of that is in Latin America. But we also have some offices in Europe as well, and I'm the head of the one in the UK, after previously being the head of the office in Spain. This is what the academy looks like. So we actually have a physical space where startups work. It's not quite a co-working space because we do give each startup their individual modules. So, and the startups stay with us not for 3 months, but for about, on an average, about 10 months in the central office in the center of most cities. And to date, we've seen, these numbers are a bit outdated because I got those numbers from a presentation about a year ago, but I think right now we've seen about 30,000 applications worldwide. Only about 1.4% of the startups actually get in, and we've invested in about 500 startups throughout our ecosystem. We also like to bring celebrities in, so I just put that picture in. But that's our last demo day with will.i.am, and we had the Duke of York, because our goal is to basically make sure that we get as many relevant people in as possible to listen to our startups, and to also make sure that they're able to network with relevant people around the world. And this is kind of just a one slide mentioning really, really quickly that this is part of a larger initiative that Telefonica is doing. Wayra sits in the middle of what Telefonica is doing with regard to entrepreneurship, but there are actually a lot of other programs, from co-working spaces to programs where we actually pay programmers to work in Wayra startups so that they can actually see what it's like to work in a startup while they're still university students. Because what we found in a lot of places is that people talented programmers aspired more to work in Telefonica than to work in startups, and we kind of wanted them to at least know that there were other options. So we paid for them to work in Wayra startups. And then we have a ventures arm, VC funds, etc. So it's part of an entire universe of options to support entrepreneurship. And what is it exactly that we offer? So we offer $40,000 in cash for the startups. If a startup is a bit more mature, and that means that they've actually had a qualified investment round prior to entering Wayra, then we'll respect the valuation of the last round. But this is assuming that this is a very early stage startup with no prior valuation. So we'll invest $40,000 in services. And the services, basically what we do is we have coaches. So what we've done is identify what are the main problems for the majority of startups, and those would usually entail things like how to get customers. So we have growth hacking coaches, how to hire people. So we have a recruitment coach. A lot of teams actually come in with more business experience than technological experience. So we have a CTO in residence. We have a sales coach. We have 3 people who are dedicated only to maintaining the relationship with Telefonica, because again, we realize that a lot of times startups don't actually know how to pitch into corporates. They don't know how to prepare. They don't know how to make a business case to the corporate. So we actually help them with that as well. And we have a bunch of other coaches, as well as also getting the mentors from all of the top VC funds and angel groups in Europe working directly with the startups. So we have three sorts of mentors. So coaches are the ones that we actually pay to come in on a weekly basis in one-to-one drop-in clinics kind of sessions. But then the mentors are the ones who just kind of donate their time. And we usually have three profiles of mentors. One is an entrepreneur who's usually from the same vertical that the startup has been in, to make sure that someone who has operational experience can actually guide you through the process and make sure that you don't make the same silly mistakes that they might have made at the very beginning of their journey. The second would be an investor coach to help you prepare for how to raise a round, and that person usually is actively working in a venture capital fund or as a business angel. And the last would be a Telefonica coach, which would be someone from the business unit that you would like to work with in a very senior position to make sure that you can begin the conversation as quickly as possible. In exchange for all of that, we usually take a 7 to 10% stake. You get, as I mentioned before, in the case of the UK, 8 to 12 months of acceleration, with the average being about 10, helping getting Telefonica as a partner. And again, I think it's really, really important to highlight how important that is. It doesn't happen in all of the cases, but even companies like Spotify, when Spotify couldn't figure out how to enter into the Spanish market, or at least how to get more Spanish people to convert to the premium package, what they did was a revenue share deal with Telefonica, where Telefonica offered it Spotify at €5 as opposed to 10 to all of their customers during the course of a year. And then Spotify found that actually led to a higher conversion of premium customers than any of the other things that they had tried. Same thing with Evernote, same thing with Dropbox. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that our startups, the very best of our startups, have access to those same sorts of distribution platforms at a very early moment in their careers. And again, our KPIs are twofold. One is how much money can we help you raise? We're trying to help our startups get as much money as possible, usually a business angel round or a VC round if they're able to develop quickly enough. And then the second is we judge ourselves by how many of our startups are actually working with Telefonica. And so these are the metrics from the last couple of years. We found that last year our startups raised about 10 million euros before December 2014. We had one startup that exited after about 6 months. We have 3 more acquisitions that are pending. They're currently in due diligence. We don't always think it's a good thing for startups to exit that quickly, but again, the decision is made by the entrepreneur, and for various reasons, they may be interested in the exits. In terms of working with Telefonica, 50% of the last cohort actually had some sort of relationship with Telefonica, usually in trials or something else. We had 27 trials completed in 2014, including some of our alumni, and we had startups that secured about 4 million euros in contracts with Telefonica, some of which I'm going to describe now or later on. We also kind of partner with all of the different leading institutions within the countries that were present to make sure that we leverage all of the networks that are available to our startups. So this is the Duke of York, the Pitch of the Palace event. This is the King of Spain. This is the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK. And we also kind of go around the world to make sure that we're accessing talent not only in the UK, but from around the world. Because what we found is that about 60% of our current cohort actually don't come from the UK. Most of them come from other places like Russia or Slovenia or wherever the case may be. I think the best example right now of a UK-based startup that's doing quite well would be TransferWise, that just secured a huge round from Andreessen Horowitz. They're actually Estonians, and that was from Tech Seed Camp that found them in one of their Seed Camp events in Estonia, I think it must have been the case. So again, the point is that the best UK talent or the best talent doesn't necessarily come from people who are born in the UK. It just means people who may come to the UK to access the money that's there or the contacts with the US, which is where a lot of people eventually want to end up just because that's where they have the huge exit markets. So this is us going to, well, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, everywhere. Oh, this slide's make it in. Ukraine and Lebanon. But I basically see it as a part of my job to go around to as many places as possible to meet people like you, to see if we can convince any of you to join as Wira cohorts and therefore to be able to leverage the Telefonica family. Like I said, like I said before, this is one of our teams at TechCrunch Disrupt. This is Olga from Russia, and this is our team, Squeeze from Slovenia. And they don't necessarily have to stay in the UK forever. Some will, some won't, but at least to come for 1 year and be able to make contacts and maybe try to see how they can access the UK market. And I alluded to this before, but why London? Well, because outside of the United States, Europe is probably the biggest market in terms of getting funding, and London is the capital of all of that. So a lot of startups do actually come to the UK just to get access to the money, and then London is also a natural bridge to the US for language and historical reasons. And we're not only focusing on Europe and Latin America, we're also focusing on making sure that our startups have access to the Asian market as well. So this is part of the reason that we reached an agreement with the Chinese government to have a Wira-powered incubator there as well. So in terms of examples of accelerators, of startups that we have, this is one of our startups that's called Yo-Yo. They're currently closing around about $5 million. They had already raised about $5 million by the time they came in, so they're actually a team that's doing pretty well. And they've been able to leverage the Wira network pretty well. They won an award, so you guys saw me before at, I think that was St. James's Palace, the Duke of York event. Well, they actually got in contact with the Duke of York. He then introduced them to Tony Fernandez, who is the current CEO of AirAsia, and they've now become the loyalty platform for AirAsia on all of its flights and on all of its terminals. So that's one example where just networking turned out to be really useful in leveraging the contacts that a big corporate might be able to provide. This is another example of a company where this guy who founded the company was formerly a venture partner in DFJ Esprit, which is a pretty big fund in Europe. But he decided that he wanted to launch this product, but not in Europe. He wanted to launch it in Latin America. This is why this should be in Portuguese, because he wanted to launch it in Brazil. And so he then targeted Telefonica because he said, you guys are huge in Brazil. I need to get there. How can we work together? Since we had an e-health vertical that was also at the same time trying to access more and more people in Brazil, it was a win-win solution, and he's the one that's getting about $3 million in contracts right now from Telefonica. The deal that we did with him in Brazil worked out so well that now they're kind of launching it in the rest of Latin America, in the other countries like Chile, Peru, etc. And this last example is actually the one I like the best, because it was a doctor who, when he started in Wira, was working part-time. And so he had a problem, which was that he saw how hard it was to schedule doctors to operate and things like that in hospitals, and so he wanted to create a scheduling system, and he was working part-time on it. He got into Wira. He said, okay, I'm going to take a year off from being a doctor. And then we said to him, well, this same problem isn't one that's limited to doctors. It's actually one that happens in a lot of companies. O2 has this problem. Why don't we try it out in 10 of our stores in the UK? We tried it out in 10 stores. That trial went well. We then extended it to about 267 stores. He got a contract for about £150,000 a year. We then decided we're going to extend it to all of the stores, including the franchisees. And now we're introducing him to other customers and seeing if there's any way we might be able to resell the solution. So I like this example because, again, it was an entrepreneur who's working part-time from Starbucks and then all of a sudden came into Wira, and given the scale that Telefonica has, either to validate your product as a first customer, a first corporate customer, or to distribute it like we did in the case of Dautissima, I think that that's kind of showing that it's not just a PR stunt, but actually something that we can do to help startups, as Michael said, get those first customers and conquer markets. Well, with that, I'll finish, and I will take any questions that you guys might have, if there's time for questions.
We're out of time now, but we have a break coming up soon, okay. So we'll catch you then. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.